This video has been brought to you by DataVinci Analytics Agency. So this video is for people who are looking for answers when it comes to particularly the implementation of Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4. How is the implementation different when it comes to Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4? So my objective is that at the end of this video module, you should be able to answer at least minimum 80% of your questions regarding the implementation of UA and GA4 if we are particularly talking about the differences in terms of the implementation, and we are assuming that the implementation is going to be done through Google Tag Manager. Alright, so what are we going to cover? We are going to look at what is the difference when it comes to the basic page load setup in Universal Analytics versus GA4. We are going to look at event tracking. We are going to look at what is the difference in custom dimension configuration in UA versus GA4. We are going to look at how you can view the reports in UA, how it's different when it comes to GA4. We are going to look at user properties. We are going to look at e-commerce tracking. And finally, we are going to look at the fields to set settings, which is there in both the tags of UA and GA4 and GTN. All right. So I am excited to start this video module, and I hope you are as well. So we have a lot to cover. Let's get cracking. So let's start with the basic page load setup when it comes to UA versus GA4. So I'm now in my Google Tag Manager container, and how you would basically set any tag, that is going to remain the same. Okay, and in case of basic page load setup, the trigger is also going to be same. That is, in most cases, you are going to fire this on all the pages. Okay, so that is going to be the same. But when it comes to tag configuration, there are certain differences. So when it was with Universal Analytics, so when you were, first of all, when it came to Universal Analytics, there was just one tag. But in case of GA4, there are two tags now: GA4 configuration and GA4 event. Okay, for basic page load setup, in case of GA4, you have to focus on GA4 configuration, and in case of Universal Analytics, anyway, there's going to be just one tag, so you have to just focus on that. Now for basic page load setup, it was very simple to do. You will just choose the track type as page view and set it to fire on all the pages. But the difference comes over here that in case of Universal Analytics, whatever configuration you had to do in the Google Analytics setting variable. So you will put your property ID over here. If there is any additional setting of, let's say, custom dimensions that you want to track on every page, or certain fields to set like allow linker and things like that, or e-commerce tracking for data layer, cross domain tracking, etc. So whatever configuration you had to do, right, that happened in the analytics variable. So there was a variable which was dedicated for analytics, right? So if you go to variables and if you click on new, so there was a dedicated variable for Google Analytics settings. So you could create multiple variables if you wanted to fire multiple Google Analytics properties on any website. Okay, but in case of Google Analytics 4, there is as such no variable, there is as such no Google Analytics variable that exists for Google Analytics 4. So you have to do all the configuration in this configuration tag only, right? So you have to put your measurement ID over here if you want to set any kind of additional fields over here, your user properties, and other advanced settings. So advanced settings are basically related for the tag sequencing and things which are available for other tags as well, but let's focus on these two. So whatever configuration you had to do, you have to do the configuration over here only, right? Now there was something that I mentioned around fields to set that I said that we will look at last, but I think going with the flow of this discussion, we can cover fields to set right now itself. So here, if you look at fields to set, right, it does not populate the fields by default, right? But if you look at your Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, and if you look at the settings variable, and if you go to fields to set, right, so there would be fields that would be suggested by Google directly, right? So these fields are the things that you can pick from here, and whatever value you want to pass, you can pass a value. For example, if it's allow linker, so you can choose allow a linker and set it to true, and other kinds of configurations that you want to do, you can do over here. But in case of Google Analytics 4, that suggestion does not come. So any kind of configuration that you want to do, for example, let's say you want to track the user ID, so that thing is not over here. So for any kind of additional fields, you need to check the developer documentation and developer support, and then understand what can be the fields over here. Are they same or are they different for Universal Analytics versus Google Analytics 4, and then populate the values over here, right? So that is the major difference, that in case of Universal Analytics, first of all, there was just one tag and you had to choose the tag type as page view, and whatever configuration was happening over here in your settings variable. But in case of Google Analytics 4, there is an additional configuration tag, right, wherein you do the configuration in the tag itself. There is no additional variable. Secondly, for things like field to set, etc., right now in the tag manager there is no suggestion on those fields. You have to look at the documentation and then see what fields you want to set. All right, so that's the basic difference when it comes to Universal Analytics versus Google Analytics 4 in terms of page view setup. The trigger is going to be same as I just said earlier. So we have learned basic page load setup, how it's different in UA versus GA4, and this was something that I was supposed to cover at the end of the video, but I've already covered. That is what's the difference when it comes to fields to set settings in the tags, particularly in GTM for UA versus GA4. Now we are going to learn about what are the differences when it comes to event tracking in UA versus GA4 and GTM, and in general the overall implementation. And there are some major differences, and if you understand the event tracking, how we do that, you would be able to understand broadly 70 to 80% of the implementation when it comes to GA4. Okay, so let's dive into that. I hope you're liking the video so far. My question to you is that would you like to help a stranger on the internet get closer to his dreams by clicking on the subscribe button? So just a recap of how you would set up an event tracking in Universal Analytics. Many of you might already be familiar with it. So the tag is going to be same. You will select this tag only, and here in the track type you will simply select it as event. Okay, so far so good. Now exclude the custom dimensions for now. Just focus on the fields that are available to you by default. So what do we have over here? We have category, action, label, and value, out of which category, action, and label are strings. These are like text strings that you can pass, and value is something that you will pass as numeric. So category, action, label are strings that you can pass, and value is something that is numeric value that you can pass. Additionally, there is an optional setting of non-interaction hit. This setting is particularly useful for calculating of your bounce rates. So if you set something as non-interaction, then it is not included in the calculation of the bounce rate. Okay, otherwise if you by default it's false, so anything that you track will affect your bounce rate calculations, right? So basically if you exclude the custom dimensions, then you are left with three fields: category, action, label, and then you have to use your discretion in defining what is the category of the event, what is the action in that particular category, and what's the label. So for example, let's say that you are creating an event for video tracking. Okay, so you can say the category is video interaction, the action can be the interaction name, so it can be like play, pause, stop, whatever, and label can be the name of the video. All right, so this is how you will pass the value to Google Analytics when it comes to events. Okay, so you are fairly limited if you do not use the custom dimensions. By default you have just 3 text fields that you can pass. Okay, now this has entirely changed when it comes to event tracking with Google Analytics 4. Okay, so in event tracking now, among the 2 tags that we have, that is GA4 configuration and GA4 event, now you will use this GA4 event tag. Okay, and now here the settings are also different. So here you have to choose the configuration tag for which you want to pass the event. So if you have multiple GA4 properties set, okay, through the same Google Tag Manager container, so you have to choose that this particular event should pass value to which configuration tag, right? So here let's take the same example that you are going to pass video interaction. Okay, and what did we pass? We passed that First of all, it's a video interaction as a category. In action, we passed what was that interaction, play, pause, stop, whatever. And in label, we passed the name of the video. Okay. Now let's suppose that you want to pass additional things as well, like you want to pass the duration of the video, and let's say that you want to pass the timestamp at which an interaction happens. So if it's a 5-minute video, you want to pass that at 1 minute this particular interaction is happening. Let's say you also want to pass the information on the URL of the page on which a particular video has been embedded. If it's a common video that can occur across multiple URL locations, you want to know that this video was being played on which page, or if you have multiple domains, then from which domain this particular video was getting played. All right, so here you have to use your discretion in giving a name. Okay, and this name can be kind of your event category, right? I'm not saying it is like a rule of thumb that you have to keep it like an event category, but anything that is intuitive, it can be event action as well, but it's totally up to your discretion. That helps you identify that what this event name or what this event is telling. So let's say I make it as video interaction. Okay, now comes the major difference between Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4, because here as such there is no strict schema that you need to follow regarding category, action, label, or whatever. You can pass up to 50 parameters over here. Obviously you will need to create the 50 custom dimensions as well. So I'm rambling a bit, I'm moving some parts, but obviously you will not want to pass 50 parameters. But the point that I'm trying to make over here is that there is as such no rigid limit on what are the number of string dimensions that you can pass in an event. So as in case of Universal Analytics, if you exclude the custom dimension, you were left with only 3, but here you can pass as many as you want. And there is another difference. So here you can pass the parameter according to make it more business friendly, to make it more user friendly. So here, like, you can pass it as video name, you can pass as video interaction, you can pass interaction timestamp, yada 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 yada, whatever you want to pass you can keep on passing. And obviously you have to create the variables to pull these values. These can be data layer values or any static values or anything that you have identified to capture the value of this particular variable that you need to pass. Okay, so I'm not getting in too much detail into how you will pass the values. You just need to understand that you need to create the variables and then pass the values to the respective parameters. Okay, so that is difference one, that you have to pass the event name, and then there is no rigid schema that you need to follow with the parameter name. It's very flexible. You can pass any number of parameters and in any manner you want, and that would start flowing into GA4. There is another difference. The other difference is that the parameter of one event name can be different from the parameters of another event name. So for example, this event name is video interaction, but let's say there was a navbar interaction event. So for this particular event, you can use entirely different event parameters. So for example, it can be menu item name, and it can be page URL, page URL. So if you want to see that on which particular page this particular menu item was clicked, so that also you can pass. You can pass the menu URL, right? So I'm just giving very high level simple examples, but the key thing that you need to consider over here is that the parameters of video interaction in the previous example and the parameters that you're passing here in navbar interaction, they are totally different. Okay, so these are the two differences that we have covered. That first is there is no set limit As such, in case of Universal Analytics, there were only 3 strings that you can pass in: category, action, label. And the other is that from one event to another event, the event parameters can be totally different, and you can use your business logic to pass these things. Right, there is another thing called user property, which we'll also discuss in some time, but let's skip user properties for now and let's focus on event name and event parameters only. Right, let's look at the next differences when it comes to event tracking, and for that we need to go to the analytics interface. So let's get into that. So we are now in the analytics interface, the Universal Analytics interface. And most of you might already be familiar on how to access the Universal Analytics events, but just a recap: you will go to behavior, you will go to events, top events, and then it will start with event category. And then when you click on it, it will go to event action, label, etc. Now, the thing to consider over here is that the moment you set up the tracking for an event in Google Tag Manager, and the moment you publish it, the moment it starts receiving the data, it will immediately start populating the reports over here. Obviously, there is a lag of 1.5 to 4.5 hours when the data starts showing up, but it starts collecting and processing the data. And at least in the real-time reports, you would be able to see all the reports. Okay, but it does not work like that in case of Google Analytics 4. Because the schema in case of Universal Analytics is fixed, it's event category, action, and label. It does not need any additional configuration. That's why the reports can directly be populated, right? But in case of Google Analytics 4, since we discussed that the schema can be flexible, you just need to pass the event name, and then you can pass the event parameters, which can be different for the different event names, but you will need to configure those parameters for Google Analytics 4. So let's look at how you will do that. But that's a difference, that in case of Universal Analytics, the moment you start passing the data, it starts getting populated in the category, action, label. But it is not the case with Universal Analytics, Google Analytics 4. Okay, let's now go into Google Analytics 4. So we are now in Google Analytics 4, and the first thing is that the interface is different. You might already be aware of that, but just in case you're not aware, then the interface is different. So to look at the events report, you need to go to reports, right? And here then you have to go to engagement, and then you have to go to your events. Okay, and here you would be able to see all the event names, right? So whatever we are going to pass here, GA4 events, so whatever you pass here, right, those event names will start coming over here directly, because the event name is a report that is already defined. You do not need to do anything additionally for it. So it starts getting populated the moment you start passing anything into event name. Okay, but the other things like event parameters, those things will not come just like that. There is as such, for example, let's say you were passing the events and you want to see, for example, you were passing the event name as video interaction, and you want to see additional things about that video name, etc. So you cannot search from here directly and expect that those things are already populating. It does not work like that. Okay, so for any parameter that is available for any event, what you can do is that you can click on an event, the name of the event, and it will show you the names of the parameters that it's collecting over here. So it seems that this particular event name is not collecting any parameter, but whatever event parameters that you are passing, and you are sure that you are passing parameters with the name of a particular event, if you click on it, then when you click on that event and you click on the parameter name, so you will see all the parameters name that are getting populated over here. And then if you click on any of them, so you can see the values, but it's not very user friendly to report that. And if you want to break one parameter with another parameter, you cannot do that over here. You can view in real time, but if you want to see the aggregated reports, etc., that is not going to be possible just by doing this. Okay, so you need to do something additionally if you want to create reports on certain parameters, right? And if you want to use multiple parameters in a single report. So let's just imagine that you have created a video interaction event, okay, and you want to create a table such that there is video name, there is a video interaction name, there is the page URL on which video was interacted, and then there are events that count the total number of interactions as such with this particular table that you have created. Okay, so for that you need to do something additional. So what you need to do is you need to go to configure, right, and here you need to go on custom dimensions, right, and then click on create custom dimensions. So there can be two kinds of custom dimensions. One is based on your event parameter and other is based on your user property. We will discuss user property later. Right now, for the time being, just assume that when we are discussing about creating these dimensions, we are talking about the event parameters, dimensions through the event parameter. You have to give a business friendly name, whatever is the name that you want to have, and all the parameters that are coming. Okay, all the parameters that are coming, if Google Analytics 4 has received the hits for those parameters, they will get populated over here, right? So you can pick any parameter from here that you have passed to Google Analytics. For example, I'm taking something very simple, let's say % scrolled, and then you can give it a business friendly name as % scrolled. Okay, you want optionally, if you want, it's a good practice, you should give the description as well. So you can give the description as well, but the point is that now once you have created this particular dimension, it is available for you to start reporting. Okay, and where would you create those reports? So you will go to your explore and then click on blank, and then here this is the analysis hub, where you can create your freeform tables, and then in the dimensions, now whatever new dimensions that you have created, they will be available. So % scroll, the way we created, now it is available and you can get that. And if you want to play around with other dimensions, let's say page URL or page path, so now you can get all the dimensions that you want. You can get the metric that you want. So let's say that is simply events. Yes, I'm doing something random over here. The idea is to just show you how you can create a table, and then you can drag and the columns and the values and the metrics that you want. Obviously, it will not show anything right now because we have not yet passed the values to it. But this is how you can create the reports in for any event parameter that you are passing with the event in Google Analytics 4 tag, that is the GA4 event tag. Now another thing to notice over here is that in case now we have already reached a stage where we are discussing custom dimensions. Okay, because to view the reports, we have to create the custom dimensions, and that was the next topic. So the thing that you need to notice over here is that in case of Universal Analytics, how you were creating custom dimensions, you were going to the Universal Analytics admin, right, and then you were going to your custom dimension, custom definition, custom dimension, and then you will create a new custom dimension. Now it was sequential, so whatever custom dimension gets created next, it will be your next index, that is it will be 9, right? And then you can set the scope, that is hit, session, user, and product, right? In case of Universal Analytics though, there are 4 scopes, but in case of GA4 there is just hit and user. Hit is essentially an event-based scope, and user is through your user property, and they are separate. So you get 50 custom dimensions in GA4 and 25 user properties. But let's say that you want to create a new custom dimension in Universal Analytics, so you create a new custom dimension and then you get an index. So you first create a custom dimension in the backend, and then you go to your analytics interface, and then you will create a event or any kind of even for page view, if you have to create a custom dimension, so you will go over here, you will then choose your settings variable, right, or you can override the settings of this particular variable, and Here then you will pass the name of the index of the variable. So in this case, let's suppose we were doing, so I will put 9 over here and the dimension value that will come from a variable. So understand, I'm just repeating if it's going too fast, that you first create a custom dimension in the admin of Universal Analytics and then you map the values in the interface of Google Tag Manager. But in case of Google Analytics 4, you first pass the value from Tag Manager. You first pass the value from Tag Manager. So whatever parameters you say, X, Y, Z, and then you go to your analytics interface and define that. You understand that the sequence is now intuitively opposite. In UA, you first create the dimension in the interface and then you map the value. But in GA4, you first pass the value in the event parameters and then you map in the interface of analytics. Okay, so that's the difference when it comes to UA versus GA4. The other difference is that in case of GA4, you get the option to modify or alter your events. So if I go to configure, then I can modify the event as well as create new events on what we are already tracking. So let's take a use case. So you create a data layer specification document and you pass it to the developer, and the developers do something on their own which is not according to the documentation that you have provided to them. So let's say you have asked them to create a custom event that was link click, but the developer passed link underscore click. Obviously, there are different things when it comes to setting your events and other things that you want to do. Okay, so you decide not to get that fixed, because obviously if you reach back to them, they will say that they will do it in the next sprint cycle and it will take a lot of time. But what you can do is you can modify that event in analytics. So let's say the event name the developer has set as link underscore click. You can say that make it link click, and you can give it a business friendly name like link underscore click to link click. Now we recently came across this situation wherein we had created an e-commerce data layer wherein the developer had passed the event name as transaction while the event name that needs to be passed was purchase. So what we simply did was that we created a rule over here to modify the event that whenever it is holding transaction, you can simply convert it to purchase. Okay, and you can just name it transaction to purchase. This you cannot do readily in Universal Analytics so easily. Okay, similarly you can create a new event. So you can say that when the event name exists is something like this plus additional condition. You can say that when in an event, the event let's say affiliation, so there is a hit where the parameter is event underscore name and it has an affiliation, and this is X and this is Y. Then you create a new event name which is Z. Okay, so just keep in mind that at a high level, if I'm not going into too much detail because obviously that will keep on expanding the scope of this video, we have to cover some topics quickly. So just keep in mind that you can modify or alter the events once they have already been collected in your GA4, but that thing is not possible with Universal Analytics. Okay, so let's do a quick recap, particularly in terms of event tracking, what we have covered so far, because I think for event tracking we covered a lot of things. So the first thing that we covered was that in case of Universal Analytics, you have the same tag you select is a tag type, you get only event action label by default. We are not going into custom dimension. But in case of GA4 event, you just need to pass the event name, and you have the entire flexibility on to pass the parameter name. And the parameter names of one event can be totally different from the parameter names of other event name. The event name report will get populated by default in your GA4, but for everything else you need to configure it. So you just need to configure it and create the custom dimensions. For your event scope, the custom dimension, the parameters that you're passing over here, your scope is event. Right, just let me open it. So this is what I was saying, that you go to custom definitions and create custom dimension, and the scope is going to be event. For your user properties, the scope is going to be user. We will cover user property in some time later. And then once you have created the custom dimensions over here, you can open your analysis hub and then view the report. Similarly for BigQuery and similarly for Data Studio. Once you have created the reports over here, then you can view separate tables, those reports individually. Otherwise you have to always go to the events report and then break it down over there, right? And lastly, what we discussed was that you can modify or create the events in GA4, but that was not possible in case of UA. We also discussed that when you have to create the custom dimensions, since we are creating the custom dimensions over here, you first pass the values over here, you first decide on the parameter name, and then you can come back over here to Analytics and create your custom dimensions. But in case of UA, you first create your custom dimensions, identify what's the index that is to be used, and then go back to Google Analytics 4 Universal Analytics tag, and then map the respective custom dimension to the value that you want to capture. Okay. Lastly, we also discussed that the category action label reports get populated readily. You do not need to do any kind of extra configuration, but in case of the parameters, you need to do the extra configuration, and that is creation of the custom dimensions. Okay. So what all have we covered so far? We have covered basic page load setup. We have covered fields to set. We saw how to do the event tracking. We saw how to look at the custom dimensions in UA versus GA4. This is something that I want to stress again, that in case of UA, you have 4 scopes for the custom dimension: hit, session, user, and product. But in case of GA4, you, at the time of creation of this video, there is just event scope and there is user scope. User scope is going to be dependent on user properties, which we will discuss next. And there is no session scope or there is no product scope as such. That's not there in the product yet. Okay. And we also briefly looked at how to view the reports in UA versus GA4. In UA, you might already be aware of, but in GA4, you go to explore and there are various kinds of reports. You click on Analysis Hub, and then you can create free form tables, etc., and create reports over there by first importing the dimensions and the metrics that you want to use in your table, and then drag and drop them in the interface to create the report. As I said, I apologize that for certain topics I am moving a bit fast, but we have to consider a scope for every video. If I go in detail for everything, then that will become a very long video and that might not be relevant for everyone. So we are covering certain things at a high level. I will create more detailed videos on things like Analysis Hub later on. Okay, so now it's time to discuss about user properties. So user properties is nothing but it is just a custom dimension which is there in Google Analytics 4, which is at a user scope. Okay, so in general, Google Analytics 4 is providing you 50 event-based custom dimensions and 25 user-based custom dimensions. So they're providing you 75 custom dimensions. So to create a custom dimension, it's simple. You go to configure and then you click on custom dimensions, and here you click on create custom dimension. Now if you keep it as event, so that will be your event scope custom dimension, and if you click on user, so that would be a user scope custom dimension, right? But keep in mind that for user scope custom dimension, you have to set your user properties, right? So let's quickly have a look at that. So where can you set the user properties? So you can set the user property at the configuration level as well, and you can set it at event level as well. So you know, in Google Analytics 4 we have a configuration tag and an event tag. So if you select Google Analytics 4 configuration, then here you can set the user properties. So setting it is similar to the way you will set your fields to set or event parameters. It's exactly similar. You just put any name which you feel conveys the business information properly. So for example, something can be login status. Okay, and then you call the variable that is that you are using to populate that value. So over here you can pass that in the user property. Similarly, let's assume that it was a GA4 event. So here you have event parameters and user property. So in user property, you can pass whatever user property that you want to set. So what would be user properties? So user property, understand this thing, gets mapped to a user ID, or in case you are not using a user ID, then it gets mapped to the cookie ID that is being used to track a user. Okay, so it will be better if we try to understand this in a sequential manner. So I'll quickly open a Google Sheet and we'll try to understand through that. So let's say that all these are going to be entries for a user. So let's say this is going to be session 1, and this is going to be session 2, this is going to be session 3, and these are the sessions from the same user. Okay, this is going to be hit 1, this is going to be hit 2, this is going to be hit 3, this is going to be hit 4, this is going to be hit 5. So let's assume that there are 3 sessions by a user and each session is having just 5 hits. Okay, and you are setting a user property that is going to be set in, let's say, hit 3 of session 2. Okay, so let's say the user property is the age of the user. So you are setting a user property to calculate, to store the age of the user in hit 3. In hit 3, let's say there is a form that the user submits in session 2, and in hit 3 you are able to retrieve the age of the user, and you are setting that as a user property. Okay, so understand this thing, that all these hits, the user property is not set, right? Because right now the user has not provided what the age of the user is, and in hit 3 the user provides that his or her age is 19. Okay, so what would happen, since Google Analytics knows that all these sessions are by the same user, so either the cookie ID or the user ID of this user which is being used to identify the user is same, this 19 will get mapped to all the previous hits as well. You're getting my point? Because this 19 will now get associated with that user. Okay, what else? This 19 is also going to get applied to all the future hits of the user, and for this you do not need to pass this user property again and again. So even if you pass this user property in just one hit and you do not change it, you do not pass the user ID, the user property again and again, it will still get attached to all the other hits, all the data points that are associated with a particular user. Okay, so you're getting my point. So when you set a user property, it gets mapped to all the hits of the user historically, as well as all the future hits if you do not change anything about the user. Obviously, if the cookie ID gets deleted, the cookie ID is changed, so it's a new user, so the property will not get mapped to that user. But as long as the cookie ID that is being used to identify the user remains the same, or the user ID that is being used to identify the user remains the same, if you set the user property just once, it will get mapped to all the hits of that user historically as well as in future. Okay, now there are certain caveats to it, right? In case of historic mapping, this will happen only if it was not set. Okay, so let's assume that the user is signing in on 2 separate days. Okay, and when the user signs in on day 3, the user is 18 years of age, right? And you're tracking that in a user property. So this 18 will get applied here historically, here in future hits, here, here, here. You just set the 18 in hit number 3 of session number 1. and it will get mapped historically as well as to the future hits. But on hit 3 on session number 2, on next day, let's suppose this happens on a Monday and this happens on a Tuesday. On Tuesday, it's the user's birthday. Okay, and when she signs in again and she passes a certain information, she is now 19 years old. Right? So what happens? Would it change the historic data? And how will this get carried forward? So the way it works is that once you have set it, it will get applied to all the future hits till the time you do not change it. But it is not going to override the data that has been already set in the past. Okay? You getting my point? If this was blank, nothing was set. If this were blank, then everything becomes 19. But if it was not blank, some value was already existing, then it will not override the historic data. It will persist for all the future hits indefinitely till this value gets updated. Okay? So that is how you can track user ID. So for user ID, you need to pass the information just once and it will persist on its own as long as the cookie ID of the user is same, and it will get mapped historically as well if the user ID of the, so as long as Google Analytics is able to identify that these are the same hits from that particular person. Okay, and how do we set it? So you have to go to the user properties, and here you need to pass the user property that you want to set. Just like event parameters, it's entirely up to you what you want to set over here. So whatever you want to set over here, you set over here. Similarly, you can, if you want to do that as at a configuration level, so you can set over here, right? And then you need to go back to your analytics, and here you have to go to configure, custom dimensions, choose the scope as user, and you will see that when it's event, it says event parameter, and when it's user, it becomes automatically the user property. So anything that you're passing as a user property, it will start showing up over here, and then you can choose that parameter, and then it will start populating in your reports from there, that point onwards. All right, so I hope this was clear. And with that, we are done with the user properties as well. Now we will look at the e-commerce tracking. What's the difference when it comes to UA versus GA4 with e-commerce tracking? So let's look at the most complicated one and something that would be most commonly used, that is e-commerce tracking. How is it different in GA4 versus Universal Analytics? So in Google Analytics, e-commerce tracking was mostly covered under enhanced e-commerce, because earlier there was basic e-commerce tracking that was there, and then there was enhanced e-commerce, which allowed you to track more items as compared to whatever you could track in the previous version of e-commerce. Okay, the thing with Universal Analytics e-commerce was that the things that you could track under e-commerce were limited. Okay, so the scope was limited, so you could track product impressions, product clicks, product details, ad remove, promotion clicks, checkout, purchases, and refunds. Now this itself covers, I think, 95% of the cases, but if there were any additional steps, right, so those things are difficult to track in this fixed structure. So for example, if you have a personalized gifting website, let's say this website, okay, now this is a product detail view. Now this is e-commerce has started over here, right? But here I add additional step of personalization, and I want to add this as my e-commerce funnel, because there can be drop-offs at this step as well. So that cannot be tracked with the existing schema of Universal Analytics, because there is no additional step to track custom events or custom dimensions in the e-commerce funnel in the regular e-commerce reports that are there in Universal Analytics. Another example can be, let's say there are one-click upsells, post-purchase one-click upsell, or post-purchase pre-confirmation one-click upsells, and that also becomes a part of your funnel, and you want to track that as well in your e-commerce journey. So that was not possible readily with the e-commerce standardized structure that was over here, but it still was decent. It covered 90 to 95% of the cases, right? Now, in case of Universal Analytics, Google Analytics 4, this has been changed. So that is the first difference between Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4, that other than the standard things that Google Analytics 4 also provides, you can also add your own custom steps. So let's say you want to add personalization, so you can add personalization as part of your checkout. It's part of your funnel. Okay, this is a very good blog by the legend Simon Hava, and this blog is kind of the guide on Google Analytics for e-commerce, and also provides a good comparison between what was earlier there and what is the corresponding parameter in GA4, right? And also what has been added and what has been removed. So as such, I don't think so anything has been removed, only new things have been added. Plus on top of that, as I said, you can provide customized steps as well to your funnel. So this provides a good comparison. So for example, earlier the ID parameter is now being called as transaction ID, affiliation is as it is, revenue is being called value, currency code is being called currency, tax is tax, shipping is shipping, products, impressions and promotions. So there were 3 separate arrays based on the e-commerce event. Now everything is just into items array, and this is one of the major things. I'll tell you how powerful this thing is and what kind of flexibility this provides you. Okay, then option, then there's shipping tier, there's another payment type, coupon is coupon, and then you have promotion ID, promotion name, creative slots, location ID, item list name, item list ID. These were earlier not there. Okay, so if you looked at the data layer that was prescribed for your Universal Analytics, so here you will see that the structure of the data layer from one kind of event to another kind of event would change. Like here, to track the product impressions, you will pass a data layer like this: e-commerce, currency code, impressions, and then your item array for which you want to pass the impressions. Similarly, let's look at product details. Okay, so here it's different: data layer.push, then e-commerce, detail, action field, and the products. Okay, now this thing has been greatly simplified when it comes to enhanced e-commerce. So you just need to pass the name of the event and the item array. So you can pass any of these predefined events. So what are the events? These events. So if you pass any of these predefined events, for example, view promotion or begin checkout or add to cart or view item, if you pass any of these, then Google Analytics would understand that, okay, this data is for view item, right? And then you just need to pass the items array. So let's look at an example for that, what I mean over here. Yeah, so here you can look at that you need to just put like view item, that is your event. Okay, and then e-commerce and your items array. This thing is common for all the e-commerce events with GA4. So let's say if it was add to cart, so you just need to put add to cart over here, and you just need to follow the same structure of the data layer. If it was purchase, you just need to follow the same structure of the data layer. Okay, so you can use just one common structure and just update the event name for Google Analytics 4, which was not the case earlier with Universal Analytics. Different kind of events, different kind of e-com data had different kinds of data layer structures. Now this greatly simplifies the implementation. Okay, so the first difference that I'm trying to tell you over here when it comes to Google Analytics 4 versus Universal Analytics is that the structure of the data layer has been simplified. The items array for all the kinds of e-com events is same. You just need to pass the name of the event, and the e-commerce and items array for all the events is going to be same. You do not need to change it from one e-com event to another e-com event. Okay, so that is the difference 1. Now let's look at Google Tag Manager. What is another difference when it comes to implementation of e-commerce tracking in UA versus GA4? So when it came to e-commerce tracking with Universal Analytics, as such, there were no e-commerce fields that were provided. What do I mean by that? So let's say you just look at your Google Analytics variable, your Google Analytics setting ID, right? Now here, the settings that were there for e-commerce were simply that whether you want to use enable enhanced e-commerce features or not, and if you wanted to use the e-commerce features, then whether you will use a data layer or there's some custom variable that you are creating, right? As such, there are no dimensions or no custom fields that you can provide. So if you simply inject the data layer as per the structure that Google Analytics has provided. So if you inject on your page a data layer like this, which is according to the structure that Google has prescribed, then if you map an event for tracking this, once you configure your analytics variable and then you create a tag which can work on this configuration, then it will automatically start picking. You do not need to do anything else. So it's a good thing and a bad thing, because if you want to customize anything, if you want to add anything, then you will not be able to do. But also, as we discussed earlier, that in case of Google Analytics versus Universal Analytics, in Universal Analytics the variables are also more or less standardized. You cannot customize, right? So since there was no possibility of customization, there were also no options as such to pass any customized data points with Universal Analytics. So whatever you will pass into the data layer, and if you create the data layer as per the prescribed method over here, and then you create a tag which can read the values from that data layer, your e-commerce tracking will start working, right? But in case of Google Analytics 4, this thing has been changed. So first of all, as we have discussed earlier, that there is no variable as such. Everything is done in your Google Analytics configuration tag only. But let's say you want to start e-commerce, so you can do that over here, right? So you just create a new tag and you can track all your e-commerce items over here. And in the event parameter, now you can pass all the data points, the dimensions that are available from the schema that Google Analytics has provided to you. Okay, so all these things that you have, for example, if it's transaction ID, so you just need to pass your transaction ID over here, and if you have already created a variable, just call that. Similarly, if it's your items array that you want to track, so you just need to pass over here as items, and you can call your entire items array over here, which can be a data layer variable for you, right? So that is a major difference, because earlier in Universal Analytics you did not have the option to pass these things differently. So you can also create some new variables that are specific to some customization that you are doing. Let's say you want to track payment error, right? So you can create a variable in the name of payment error, right? And if your developer is passing that into the data layer, you can just pass that along with your e-commerce data, and you can include that thing in your e-commerce funnel, right? So that is a huge advantage, right? Because now what you need to do is you can do everything in a single tag. You do not need to create things differently. You do not need to manage your data layer differently. You can do everything in a single tag. So what a hack can be over here is that, let's say this is your data layer, okay? And as you know, I will not get into too much detail into this, but I'm assuming that you know how your custom event trigger works in Google Tag Manager. So your custom event will be dependent on the value that you pass in event, okay? So what you can do additionally is, let's assume that this is the data layer that you're pushing, okay? We'll take 3-4 examples over here. So let me open Google Docs, right? So this is your data layer for view promotion. What you can do instead is that you can pass this as ecom event. Let me first, copy this, okay? You can pass this as ecom event, right? And you can create a new custom variable in the name of event name. So this is a custom variable, right? And you can pass your view promotion over here. So for view detail as well, you can still keep it as ecom event, and you can go over here and refer to the name of the event that is for view product detail, and in this case it is view item. So just copy that, and you can pass that over here, right? And if you want to just pass one, so you can remove this, right? So you can use the same event, but you can change the event underscore name. I'm coming to the point that what I'm trying to teach over here. What's the advantage of this approach? Let's take one last example, and let's say that this is for cart edition. So your event will still be ecom event, but your event underscore name will be according to here, add to cart. Okay, now if this were purchase, so you can also add your transaction ID. So XYZ, you can add your value. Okay, and let's assume you want to make it transaction. Okay, so what you can do first is that you can create a variable that records the value of the event underscore name. Okay, so let's go over here, create a data layer variable that records the value event underscore name. Right now, for all the items that are there in your e-commerce, you can create all the variables just like this. So for example, this can be ID, because you are passing the transaction ID in your in your transaction ID parameter. So whenever you pass something in the transaction ID parameter, you can pick that in this particular variable. So let's assume so what you need to do is you can create all the variables that you are going to pass in all your ecom events, right? So if you are going to pass all this in your ecom events, you just need to create the variables for all of this that pick the value from your data layer, right? And then you go to your tags, and you create in Google Analytics e-commerce tag. Now understand this thing, that this now you can pick dynamically, because when you pass something in ecom underscore name, that value can be picked dynamically here, and you will start creating all the event variables, event parameters as per your e-commerce schema. So you can call transaction ID, items array, value, anything that you want to call in a customized manner. You can keep on adding that. Now for the trigger, you just need to create one trigger. And here what we are saying in this example, ecom underscore event. Getting my point? So you can do the entire e-commerce implementation with just one tag and one trigger. If there is some customization, let's say there is a personalization step, and you ask your developer to follow the same schema that is being provided for e-commerce, but you change this according to your own preference, and let's say you pass over here personalization. So that will also get tracked over here, and whatever parameters you pass over here, they will get recorded. Now if something is absent, so for example transaction ID is absent when a product is being viewed, because at that time someone is viewing, someone is not making a purchase, so it will remain a null value and it will not affect your implementation as such. Okay, so the third difference between Universal Analytics and GA4 is that you get the option to add your own parameters over here other than the standard parameters that Google Analytics has provided to you. Right now, understand this thing, that the standard parameters do not need any kind of configuration in the Google Analytics interface. But if you are adding some kind of custom parameters, some kind of custom event parameters, then you can simply create the new fields for those, and they will also start flowing in regularly. So what I mean over here is, let's say you have introduced a step of personalization and you create a new dimension in the name of the scope is going to be event, and you will say that personalization added, right? And in that event parameter you are passing the kind of personalization someone is doing. Personalization according to the size, personalization according to the photo, according to the color, and you want to include that. So you can, whatever parameter you are passing over there, you can just call that parameter over here and it will also start flowing in. So for the standard parameters that Google Analytics have provided you, the events and parameters that is there, you do not need to do any kind of customization. But if you want to do any kind of customization, you simply can come over here and add that parameter as part of your funnel. And then when you create your reports, you can see the entire funnel including your custom parameters as well in the same Google Analytics report. That was not possible with Universal Analytics. Okay, so what are the three things that we have understood when it comes to e-commerce tracking in UA versus GA4? Let me just repeat that. So number one was that your structure of the funnel, the things that you could track with the Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, were fixed, right? And even though this list was exhaustive, but if you wanted to track any new data points, any additional custom dimensions, any custom metrics and things like that, so they could not be part of your e-commerce funnel, right? You could track those additionally, but you would need to create new reports altogether, particularly if you want to track things like item arrays in your customized steps. So that was not possible. Okay, but in case of Universal, in case of Google Analytics 4, other than the standard dimensions and the data points that they have provided, you can add your own data points as well, right? That is one difference. The second difference that we discussed was that in case of Universal Analytics, the data layer structure was different for different kinds of data points over here. So for promotion, there was a different data layer structure, purchase had different, then detail had different, right? But in case of your Google Analytics 4, the structure of the data layer has been made consistent across all kinds of data points, right? Now because of this, the advantage is that now you can create everything just through a very less number of tags, right? And it reduces the complication as such. So this brings us to the third difference between UA versus GA4. That is, in case of Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, you could not add any of those custom parameters, or there was no possibility of modifying the schema or anything that was related to e-commerce. You could just choose whether you want to pick it from data layer or you want to pick it from some other variable. But the choices were very limited. But in case of Google Analytics 4, as we just saw, that you can create your own customization, you can create your own parameters, and the things that are according to the documentation of Google Analytics 4, for that you will not need to do any kind of customization in Google Analytics interface. They will automatically start picking. They are predefined, so you will not consume your custom dimensions for the e-commerce variables that are standardized. So your 75, that is 25 user properties and 50 custom dimensions are for additional customization that you're doing, that are other than the standard e-commerce reports that are available for you, right? So this is the third comparison, that you can now add the fields over here in your tags, which was not possible with Universal Analytics. All right, so I hope this was clear, and you might need to revisit what I have just told about Universal Analytics versus GA4 again, because it's difficult to compact all the information in one video. E-commerce tracking can be a video in itself, a detailed video in itself. But if you go through the topic again, if you go through the video again, and if you obviously try to implement this on your own website, you will understand the nuances of what I'm trying to say over here. All right. So yeah, with that I would like to conclude the video. Alright, so I tried my best to ensure that we stick to the point, but still I think by the time I finish editing the video, it will be at least an hour, right? But we have covered a lot of things, and this should also help you to understand the nuances about GA4 in terms of implementation compared to Universal Analytics. So just a recap of what we have covered so far in this video. So we looked at the differences between UA and GA4 when it comes to basic page load setup. We also looked at fields to set. We looked at event tracking, custom dimensions, how to view the reports, and we looked at user properties. We looked at e-commerce tracking. So those of you who have invested the time in actively learning, you are an Avenger now. I just congratulate you on investing your time in progressing when it comes to your domain. And just in case you have not subscribed, so please subscribe to the channel. It gives me motivation, and more good stuff coming soon. Take care. Bye.